Hi all, welcome to the Riot Lunch and Learn series, the place where we spotlight Riot sponsors and partners. My name is Natalie Ballard. I'm the Events and Operations Manager for Riot. Just a quick couple reminders before we get started. This event is being recorded and will be posted to Riot's YouTube channel and uploaded to the meetup page where you registered for this event. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please place them in the chat. I will be monitoring the chat and will read the questions aloud throughout the presentation. Questions are read aloud for those watching the presentation at a later date. Finally, please keep yourself muted throughout the event to help mitigate background noise. Today, we have Marlana Bunn from ExtensisHR to discuss HR 101 for startups and small businesses. Marlana, I'll turn it over to you.
Hi, everybody. Hope everyone's day is off to a great start. Nice to meet you all, and I'll try to get through this as quickly as possible. And if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. I'm happy to address those questions now, or if you want to put them in the chat, I'll certainly try to keep an eye on that as well. Thank you, Natalie, for letting us, do a little one-on-one overview of, HR. I know HR is a pretty big umbrella, human resources for small companies. I know there's a pretty big misconception that small companies don't need HR because you really don't need human resource support until you hit, 50 or 100 employees. Whereas there's just some different regulations, different best practices that do tend to come up when we onboard a lot of our clients. So I'll tell you a little bit about, some of the common questions we get that are usually pretty burning hot topics for a lot of small companies when we go through the process of getting a proposal together, but also just in general, a lot of the questions we get asked as we go through those HR questions. Just to tell you a little bit about myself so you know who's talking to you today. So I'm a PEO consultant with ExtensisHR. You've probably never heard of us before. We are expanding our market in the Carolinas here. We are a nationwide PEO, which is short for Professional Employer Organization. So essentially what that means is we pull lots of small businesses under our umbrella to access our HR compliance services, consulting, as well as the employee benefit portion, which is historically why a lot of small companies navigate towards a PEO is because we can pull these businesses under our umbrella so they can access the economies of scale when it comes to benefits, because that's usually the first entry point. We get a lot of phone calls. It's not so much the HR, it's, hey, we need to offer benefits even though we're only a handful of employees. So we can recruit talent, but also I would like to have health insurance as a business owner. And then usually HR is a secondary to that. Hey, now we have to manage these benefits, and now we need to get a handbook in place. And now that we have a couple employees, we need to get workers' comp together. So we'll go through all those, mandatory things that you really should have as a small business. So I've been in the HR industry for quite some time. I'm part of the Carolina Angels Network and a limited partner in the Tweener Fund. I'm from this area, so I'm very invested in growing our market, not only for ExtensisHR, but providing resources for small companies to see them be successful and grow in this market and just continue to make, North Carolina, a really great place to live and work and onboard amazing talent. And I have 2 kids. Hopefully none of them pop in the room, but if they do, I apologize now. So just as I said, who we are as a company, so you know who's talking to you today. Like I said, a PEO, we work with a lot of small businesses from 2 employees up. And it's just really important as a small company to understand the resources you have at your fingertips as you are trying to grow, as you are trying to get additional funding, and what VCs like to see you have. They really just want to make sure that you have the right things in place to scale and manage your employer risk profile. So some of the basics that when companies first come to us as a PEO, some of the biggest questions they have is around basic compliance. Hey, we have a bunch of 1099s, but should they be W-2s? Or should there be a mix there? We are starting to hire remote workers in other states. And what does that mean? When do we need to get an employee handbook together? What does that even look like? Most people don't want to become Google attorneys and Google these things, during their precious hours, when you should be working on your mission, your vision, and just overall taking care of way more important things or taking a nap. Everyone needs some downtime. Documentation, what you should be documenting, why you should be doing that, what kind of protection it brings to you, the different business insurances you should have from an employer perspective when you start hiring employees, And then just really things about recruiting talent, just some basics about, how to get that talent in the door, how to highlight benefits. If you're not at the point where you think you can offer health insurance and things like that, what are the other benefits that employees are asking for that's really important as a gold standard? Onboarding, how to successfully onboard these folks, just some tips, and then just general engagement tools. How do you keep these employees engaged? What are some different things other companies are doing, that are that are very low cost or no cost at all? And then I'll have a slide on some resources that you can tap into. So any questions so far? I'll take silence as compliance. So a couple things when it comes to 1099 versus W-2. The biggest thing is just the risk associated. I talked to a lot of companies that are like, I'm going to take the risk on the 1099 factor, or my employees want to be 1099s. Well, that's not really up to them. It's really up to the government. Unfortunately, they're how you have to pay your folks. So, if you're a small company, $50 is not a big deal for each misclassified W-2. Where you're going to get into some of the bigger risks is going to be that 40% of FICA taxes. So FICA is Social Security and Medicare payroll tax. That's 7.65% of every dollar an employee makes. So for example, if you're paying someone, $100,000, 7.65% of that for the employee and for the employer would add up, and you would pay 40% of that as a penalty for that employee. So those are the kind of things that, not to be a scare tactic to say, everyone needs to be a W-2. If there is a traditional 1099, certainly continue to pay them as a 1099. But if you feel like there's a gray area, that definitely may be up for review, just to make sure you are staying on the up and up when it comes to the IRS. So the big three classifications that they look for are behavioral, financial, and then just the type of relationship overall. So behavioral are things like, does the company have control over, the workers' hours? Are you making them sign off on policies? Are you navigating their work, or are they bringing their expertise to work on a specific project? And it's just project-based work that they're doing. They come in, they do the job, they leave, they invoice you, versus you saying, hey, I need you to work from 9 to 5. I need you to sign off on these company vision, mission statements. I need you to sign, really any policy that would be more applicable to a traditional employee. Financially speaking, a 1099 really should be invoicing you for their work, for their time. They should be able to set their own hours. You really shouldn't be reimbursing them for computers or phones or anything like that. Any tools or supplies should be provided by the 1099. Think of it as, for example, if you hire on a fractional CFO, they're going to be coming with their own level of expertise, probably their own systems. Now, if you have to train them on your system where to pull the reports they need to do their job, that's one thing. But you're not saying, I need you to report into this co-working space from 9 to 5 and, really managing their work. So any questions on the 1099 and W-2? And I don't see any questions, so I'm going to keep on trucking. Multi-state workers, this is where we have a lot of questions, especially when we onboard a new client. Some of the biggest things we see is the state registrations that aren't completed. So we've had companies with just, 3 or 4 employees, but they are, in different states where they're only registered in, say, North Carolina, because that's where the company is headquartered. So unfortunately, if you do hire people in other states, you do have to register in those states for your state IDs to report state payroll taxes, but also you need to make sure you're registered for state unemployment purposes, because if you're not, and you do terminate someone in another state and they try to file for state unemployment, they aren't able to. And that's when things start to open up the books on, okay, well, what else is going on here that this company isn't doing? So, you certainly don't want to get, caught unaware of those things, or you might get notices in the mail that you're not really sure of. So just making sure, if you do have someone in another state that's working in another state on a remote basis, that you're registering in all those states with the different state agencies. Pay frequency. And then all of these blue, they're hyperlinks that might be helpful for you. So for example, pay frequency, again, if you're hiring people in different states, and for example, you want to pay everyone monthly, depending upon the state, you can. In some states, you have to pay folks biweekly or semi-monthly. So just making sure you're aware of how you have to pay those folks. That typically comes up a lot as well. Some states do require you to offer sexual harassment and anti-discrimination. For example, in New Jersey, you have to, within 90 days, the employee has to complete sexual harassment or anti-discrimination. It has to be done with a certified program, and there has to be some sort of certification or sign off. So those are the kind of things just to keep in mind. It really is state dependent. And also it depends on sometimes how many employees you have in that state. So there's just so many complexities there when it comes to training requirements. So if you do have employees in multiple states, that is something worth looking into. Paid leave. There are about 13 different states, and there's a hyperlink there that goes through that, where you do have to pay for sick time and track sick time. New York and California are the two big states that do require that. Maryland is on the cuff. I think Texas is next, where you do have to make sure you're tracking sick time for your employees. Even if you're offering quote unquote unlimited PTO, you still have to prove that you're offering sick time and that employees can't take advantage of that in a trackable way. Some states do require that you provide caregiver leave. That could be anything from maternity, paternity, taking care of a sick parent. So it really depends on that state there. And there is a state chart that goes over what type of leave you have to pay for. And now there's other states that are going to be adopting things like pregnancy and miscarriage leave and things of that nature. So, this changes every year. So just staying up to date on it is pretty important if you are looking to hire in different states, just to make sure you're staying compliant there. Reasonable accommodations comes up a little bit here and there. It really depends on if there's an employee who, needs a specific service because maybe they have something regarding mental health or physical health, or they need, an emotional support animal or something along those lines. So really just digging in and finding out, okay, how do we make this reasonable accommodation? Are we in a co-working space? What are their rules? Are we, is everyone working at home and this is really a moot point? So making sure that there's reasonable accommodations for those things, pregnancy, breastfeeding, depending upon, where you're located or where your employees are located. If they're working out of if they're in another state and they're in like a WeWork versus somewhere like a Raleigh Founded, that could be something just to be aware of, wherever they're reporting into, what are the services available there. Gender identity, this is coming up more and more. In terms of, it's just like any other surgery, in the eyes of the Department of Labor, just making sure there's reasonable accommodations for time off and leave policies there. Another thing that comes up is overtime. There's a big misconception that if you pay someone's salary, you do not have to pay them overtime. That's not necessarily the case. There's a white collar exemption, meaning if you're part of an administrative professional or a computer worker or someone like that, that's typically sitting at a desk doing your job every day, as long as you're paying them a minimum salary of $35,000, typically you would not have to pay them overtime if they're working over 40 hours a week. However, if they're making less than that threshold, they could earn overtime over 40 hours a week. So just keep in mind, just because they're a paid salary doesn't mean they don't get overtime. And I know with small companies and startups, sometimes it's all hands on deck. It might not happen all the time, but if someone is historically working more than 40 hours a week and they're below that salary threshold, you might have to pay back overtime. If it's something where, they do make a complaint or they do, file for state unemployment and say, no, I wasn't ever getting overtime, but I was working over and I was making under $35,000 a year. It's a hard thing. That's usually not a big deal, but it's just something to be aware of. Excuse me. So just some general tips. It's really good from when you start hiring on 1 or 2 employees to go ahead and start out with an employee handbook. You could get some basic, templates from SHRM for pretty inexpensive. Society for Human Resource Management. There's some online legal services that can give you templates. Just be sure that the templates that you're getting are relative to the states you're in. You certainly don't want to dump 50 50 states worth of Department of Labor state policies that are not applicable to your employees, because certainly some states do require you to pay for caregiver leave where others do not. So you don't want to put things in your handbook that aren't applicable. And then also company size. So there's some labor laws that start to become effective at 20 employees and 50 employees and 75 employees. If you're only 5 to 10 employees, that might not be something that's applicable to you at this point, but it's something to keep on your radar. So just keep in mind that, creating something like that, just if there are some tools you're looking into, keep in mind the employee count and the states you're in. And then with an employee handbook, just making sure if there are any benefits you're offering, that those are listed as well, so it's easily accessible. Any grievance process. So if you only have a handful of employees and someone has a complaint about another employee, there should be a way to, where do they come directly to the owner? Do they go to an administrator? What's the process look like? What's the investigation process look like? Is it a safe place? Employees just want to make sure they feel safe to say, hey, this happened or this was said, and I don't really know how to handle it, but I do want to go to you, and I'm following the process here that you laid out in the handbook. So those are the kind of things just to make sure that you're thinking about, keeping them broad in terms of, please get in contact with us. Disciplinary action could be taken. Maybe not have anything super specific, like this person will be put on leave or this person will be immediately terminated. It's more of, there will be disciplinary action, taken depending upon, the severity of the issue. Just your general employer policies and guidelines, just anything. If you do typically, if you want people to report in 9 to 5, if you have more flexible work environment, just making sure anything in there is just spelled out so everyone understands what's expected, different culture, if it's, open door policies, or there's anything really related to your culture or guidelines for the company. Dress code policies, I know those are kind of the way of the past these days, but if there is something that's specific, maybe they have to wear a uniform for a certain client, any of those things, just make sure you're laying those out and you're thinking about, what you want your employees to know. Like we talked about, any disciplinary process, you want to keep it pretty broad. You don't want to nail it down. We typically don't like to put in a 3-strike rule, only because that really gives everyone 3 strikes before you're out. So keeping it broad to say, disciplinary action will be taken and documented to make sure, we're in line with the company's mission and vision and values. Another big thing to have in your handbook is expense policies. So these come up here and there when employees do start to use their own personal vehicle to travel, especially if you start to hire salespeople or account managers or anyone that's going out to visit clients, or do something on behalf of the company, making sure that you're paying the correct mileage for that state. Or if people are traveling and they're putting things on a company credit card, what's your standard? Is there a certain threshold for how much they can spend on a hotel, for example, or if they are going and traveling and they're spending money on lunch and dinner and taking clients out, do you have a threshold of what you're willing to expense and what's over that? Because those things can start to get a little bit once the company starts to grow, those things get a bit fluid, and then having to backtrack and put expense policies in place get a little bit more difficult once you start to grow and have these things come up more often. And then just really document. That's just a big key. Anything that you say verbally to an employee doesn't really exist in terms of if you say, hey, you're disciplining someone, but you're doing it in a verbal way, you really should have a signed acknowledgement. It doesn't need to be in writing. It can be through email where they acknowledge they received the email, or you send a read receipt, or just something along those lines that acknowledges that employee did receive that, maybe that write-up, or, hey, this isn't in line with our company values. This is really important for us that you recognize this and really taking corrective action. Any feedback, positive, negative, anything like that. Feedback is really important to employees. It really gives them a sense of knowing where they stand. So if you're not giving an employee feedback and then all of a sudden they're getting to the point of being terminated or put on plan, that could be a pretty big shock for them, because they may have had no idea that they weren't they weren't, doing the job that they were hired on to do, or, maybe they're just not a good fit overall. If there's not any feedback taking place pretty regularly, then someone could, it could really create a lot of, uncertainty in doing their job. So it really just boils down to clear expectations, open door policy, making sure everyone feels comfortable, coming to you or coming to whoever is going to be that point of contact. Maybe it's operations, maybe it's an administrator, just really anyone that is, or a manager, if you start to hire and you really want to have a manager and be that next level of contact. Terminations, if you are going to terminate someone, just ensure that however you're doing that is in line with whatever you set up in your handbook, but also that you document the reasons why you're terminating them, refer back to the job description they were hired to do, or the company vision or value statements that they may not be aligned with, and just make sure that they're signing off on that prior to leaving the organization. We are in a right to work state, and many states are the same way, where you could terminate anyone at any point in time. It's just going to be the repercussions, what they could come back and say, like, hey, I was discriminated against, or they fired me because they just didn't like me, and everybody was, ganging up on me, and I feel discriminated against in this environment. At that point, it really just helps to make sure you have all of your documents in a row. Interviewing, I put some tips here on interviewing, what to stay away from. I know a lot of times when we go through the interview process, you do want to learn about that person as a human being and a person, but just generally staying away from questions, age, pregnancy, do you have small children, anything like that. Just things like that will come up naturally in conversation, I think, and it's fine as long as that person's volunteering that information. But asking, specific questions about their family or lifestyle or something like that, or religion, usually those are the big ones to stay away from. There's some others in there as well, but those are just some of the big things you just want to be conscientious of as you are walking through the interview process. Because if you don't hire someone and they may say, hey, I wasn't hired from this company because I told them I had small kids and they thought I couldn't do the job. Things like that do come up, which is pretty unfortunate, but it does happen. Background checks. So I included a little link there as well. There's some states that you can't put on the paperwork that they have a criminal past. So there's ban the box in some states to level the playing field for everyone, to have an equal opportunity to get the job. So just being aware of what you can and can't put on the application. There's a lot of technology out there to help you navigate those waters. A lot of background check providers that can help you understand what you should and shouldn't have on your applications. And then in general, just consistency, in terms of just making sure that you're consistent across the board for all employees. If you are going to be offering things like healthcare, making sure that you're contributing to those benefits consistently. Now, if you want to offer a little bit more for an executive versus, maybe an administrator or something like that, things like that, as long as people are in different jobs, different departments, those are the kind of things that are okay because it's dependent upon the department. But if you are thinking about saying, I only want to offer benefits to a subset of my employees, well, that's not consistent and okay. Or you want to offer PTO to employees that have been there a little bit longer, if they're grandfathered in employees or something like that is fine as well. There are different PTO policies where people accrue more time as they've been there longer at the company. But technically speaking, things like, if someone's in the same department as someone else, giving them more towards their benefit than the other person, that could be perceived as discriminatory. So just keeping in mind, consistency usually is key, or how you're disciplining your employees. If you're going to discipline one employee for being 20 minutes late, you got to discipline everybody for being 20 minutes late, if that's something that's important. So just consistency in nature is going to be really a big deal there. Any questions so far? All righty. Business insurance. So a couple mandatory business insurance you should have. General liability, that should start from just day one. When you start your company, having general liability is something you got to get. And then workers' comp. Some states require you to have workers' comp at one W-2 employee. North Carolina is 3 W-2 employees, but most states do start at 1 or 2. So just again, making sure you understand where your employees are located and if you have to have workers' comp, depending upon that state. I know it seems silly if most people are sitting at a computer all day, but one of the #1 work comp claims for desk workers, that's going to be carpal tunnel. So that's a pretty big claim when it comes to administrative workers for workers' comp. Some other insurances to consider, they're not mandatory, but they're pretty important to have, especially if you're going up for rounds of funding and really trying to display to that venture capital angel firm that you're taking necessary precautions to protect the assets of the business and just generally protect the business, making sure that you have the opportunity to scale. So there's no penalties that could come out of left field and prevent you from getting to the different levels of the business that you want to get to. So employers practice liability insurance. This is a insurance that protects you if an employee if you do terminate or they leave on their own terms, but decide to sue the company. Discrimination is a big one. The typical average lawsuit is $250,000. So usually EPLI will protect a company up to $1 million in a lawsuit. And usually the deductible ranges, depending upon the type of policy that you buy, can range anywhere from $20,000 to $50,000. So when you think about the lawsuit, if it's $250,000, but you're paying $25,000 as a deductible, that's a pretty low deductible for something that pays out up to $1 million in a lawsuit. So keeping in mind, those are the kind of things that can protect the assets of the company. Directors and officers, errors and omissions, those are just really good to have as well. Venture capital firms love to see that in place, just again, protecting the assets of the company. Cybersecurity is becoming a bigger one now that hackers are becoming a lot more sophisticated. They are able to dupe a lot of people, a lot of employees, and that can really be very crushing to a business to have to pay out to someone who's holding your files ransom, which has become all the rage these days. So just keeping in mind, seeing if cybersecurity is right for your business. One of the other trainings that some states are now requiring is cybersecurity, but that really should just be a best practice with any company, is making sure your employees have some form of cybersecurity training, what not to click on. I mean, these hackers are getting so sophisticated. One of the things our company does, our IT team does, is they send us they try to dupe us, I guess is the best way to say that. They will send out all kinds of different notices from the CEO or from your manager that looks like it's from your manager, asking you to click on something, and it looks very legitimate. And if you're working quickly and you're multitasking, it can easily be done by anyone. So those are the kind of things just to keep in mind. Yes, phishing emails. Those are all the rage as well. It's just very important to understand and educate your employees so they're not putting your company at risk. No one wants to click on anything and really affect the company in a negative way. It's usually done completely by accident. If your employees are driving company vehicles, I mean, auto is just specific to if you have company vehicles, you're going to want to get auto insurance for those folks. Recruiting talent, this is probably a much bigger discussion, but overall, what we see when we're onboarding a company, the biggest question they ask is, what is the most important thing other than healthcare to a lot of employees when they're considering a job? So 66% of workers consider a good benefit package to be the biggest determining factor in whether to take a job or not. One of the biggest benefits is flexible schedules. So that's definitely become very top of mind for a lot of companies. And how does that fit within, getting back to customers on time, or, really, what does that look like for your group? Every company has different responsibilities, and maybe they have to have certain hours. And again, it really just depends on the type of business that you are and what you can offer in terms of a flexible schedule. But not everyone is 9 to 5 these days. If it has to be 9 to 5, it has to be 9 to 5. But if there's some flexibility there and people are not morning people and they really want to work 10 to 6, or, they need to take off a few hours during the day, but they're going to, make it up at some point, really what does that schedule look like? Do they want to take off some time to go to a school activity or just something like that? Joining a company like Extensis, we have a very flexible schedule. We do have to get back to people. We do process payroll and have benefits. And, there's some things that are very time sensitive, but from a broader perspective, we have a very flexible work environment. Not a problem. And so other than that, really making sure if healthcare is important, just seeing what's available out there. And we could talk about that towards the end on the resource part of things. Health reimbursement accounts are becoming asked about more and more these days as well. In conjunction with healthcare, dental and vision are being asked about. And it really depends on the demographics of the people that you're hiring. If you're hiring, people coming straight out of college and they're still on their parents' insurance, it definitely isn't as top of mind as someone that might be getting married or have a family or have a partner that doesn't have healthcare that's really important to them. Making sure you're offering PTO if sick time is something you've got to offer because of the state they're in. But even just offering sick time is very helpful if they have to take care of a sick kid, they themselves are sick, or they're taking care of a sick friend or a parent. That really could fall under that umbrella of sick time. Holidays, just making sure those are in your handbook, but also, floating holidays have become more popular. So instead of the company picking out the holidays that you get paid for, a lot more companies are offering floating holidays where you get a bucket, a number of holidays, and you get to decide what are the holidays you want to take off, because not everyone celebrates the same holidays. Not everyone has the same religious beliefs. And, what might be a really important holiday to one person, may not be to another. So a lot more companies are navigating more towards the floating holidays so people can pick off what days they want off. Things like time off for volunteer work, school events, that could be, it could be a child, a spouse, a friend, anything that's important in that person's life to take off for. And then bereavement. I've seen some companies really limit bereavement, but I think, keeping it a little bit more broad for what bereavement could cover, because bereavement can be very personal to that employee. Again, it could be a friend, it could be someone very close to them. It's really just going to depend on the situation. So keeping it flexible is really helpful in making sure your employees feel supported. 4-day work week has come up quite a bit. This is really going to depend again on, your specific company and the customers you have to get back to. And, again, that's really going to be very dependent upon, what's going to be important to your company. Summer Fridays are something, I've seen very popular as well. So during the summer, a lot of companies will say afternoon, after lunchtime on Friday, everyone takes off. Now, if the house is on fire or, there's a very urgent project going on, those are things that could bend the rules a little bit. But for the most part, a lot of companies are adopting things like summer Fridays or starting to look into a 4-day work week and what that would mean. EAP, Employee Assistance Program, or any mental health support. So other than healthcare, there are a lot of inexpensive programs out there to tap into, to pay for your employees to get a couple sessions with a counselor. So those are just programs to make sure if your employee is going through something, that they certainly have the resources to tap into, like an EAP program, or I know there's a bunch of apps out there that provide telehealth from a counseling perspective. So just seeing, what those cost, if that cost is something you can take on for your employees, or at least make them aware that there are those support tools out there. 401ks, they do get asked about quite a bit as well, or any financial wellness tools, budgeting, how to save for retirement. If you're not at the point where you can offer a 401k, certainly looking to see what other financial resources are out there for employees to tap into, because they can certainly set up their own IRAs and roll those over. But at this point, if 401k is something you want to tap into, it can be a little bit expensive. There can be some testing involved, but there's a lot of different resources specifically for small businesses to take a look at to see if it would work for you. Wellness, any reimbursements for gym equipment, membership, classes. We reimburse for things like Pilates apps and or a Beachbody app or something like that. So those things are like $30 a month, and the employees can get reimbursed for those if that's something you think would be helpful. Or if there's a gym close by that most employees like to go to, you can certainly offer reimbursements for things like that, just to keep everybody on the wellness track, because healthy employees are typically happy employees. Unique benefits, there's some things like pet insurance, childcare reimbursements through flexible spending accounts. Again, this is really dependent upon your group. There could be caregiver reimbursements. I know there's a lot of different startups coming about where you could pay $15 an hour to have your child watched on a backup care perspective, or maybe you're caring for a sick parent. So there's a lot of different resources out there to make sure if an employee is taking care of someone, a child, a spouse, a friend, a parent, that there's resources out there that could be helpful for them, so they feel like they can get the help that they need, so they're able to focus on their job. Engagement tools, there's a lot of engagement tools out there, but one of the big things is just that we've seen with a lot of companies is just recognition. Even if it's something small, if you notice an employee taking another employee under their wing and being really a mentor, or they were on a call with a client, they knocked it out of the park, just sending an email saying, hey, I heard you on this call, you really knocked it out of the park, or hey, thanks so much for taking John under your wing, this is not a requirement of your job, just wanted to say I recognize what you're doing. Just sending a note of recognition is it's inexpensive free way to give your employees a little pep in their step, and make sure they feel like they're contributing to the organization in a positive way. There are engagement tools out there. 15Five is one that's pretty popular. We use that one as an automated engagement tool, meaning it sends us check-ins every week. Well, now it's bi-weekly because every week was a little much, but it depends on how often you want to check in with your employees, especially if you have remote employees, just making sure you're keeping a pulse on the organization, keeping a pulse on engagement, and making sure there's tools to automate that, just to make your life a little bit easier and a little bit more efficient. That really just comes down to those remote and hybrid workers, just staying connected. If you're not always in the same office, reporting together, working, seeing each other face to face every day, really just being able to talk with your folks. How was your weekend? How are things going? I know everybody was sick in your house last week. How are you guys doing now? Just making sure you're staying connected with those folks, because sometimes working from home all the time, you can feel a little bit like you're on an island, and just making sure people feel like they have someone to reach out to if they even just need to have a chat during the day. Other ways to really engage is just making sure employees feel like they have the opportunity to drive their own initiatives, or that, the company is generally open to suggestions. So if, being a small company, somebody coming from a bigger company or another company may have a great idea on what was, what they wanted to spearhead, but maybe didn't have the opportunity to, but could be very helpful for the organization. So just keeping the door open to those suggestions, because you never know what someone could bring to the table that could really have a big impact on your company, and maybe giving them their own autonomy to drive those initiatives. There's different tools or project management tools you could tap into, or you could simply just use G Sheets until you see things, really take off, to see if this is something you want to continue to pursue. But at the end of the day, what can these employees share? What have they seen successful? What have they learned in the past that might be very successful, that could be, parlayed into your company? Obviously not violating any non-compete agreements, but from a broader perspective, just what ideas other people have. And then just overall creating an inclusive environment where all opinions, thoughts are safe to share. It doesn't matter who you are within the organization. If you are, just got hired on day 2, all the way up to someone who's been there for a really long time, you just don't know what could come out of those conversations. Excuse me. And in terms of onboarding, really just making sure you're limiting paper or, attachments back and forth. Oh, I'm so sorry. Hey, Jackson, go see this out on the phone, okay? Sorry about that. So Just limiting any attachments back and forth, especially if you're going to be taking employee social security numbers or anything like that in terms of background checks or something like that. Just keeping things in tools like an HRIS system, any background check. There's a bunch of background check vendors where it's secure, where you put your information in versus putting it on, saying a PDF and emailing that back and forth, or just really trying to eliminate as much paper as possible in that back and forth, because again, hackers are very, very sophisticated these days. They can certainly get a hold of that information out of email. In onboarding, just making sure there's some form of training, who they can go to, even if it's just some basic training and you're not really sure what training looks like. You could certainly ask that employee, in terms of, have you had training in other companies? What did that look like? How was that structured? But just giving them even a skeleton of what to expect, within the first few days, first few weeks. What are the goals that you have for them within this first, 6 months? Where do you want them up to speed? Just making sure there's some form, keeping it flexible is fine, but just giving them some form of benchmarks to hit. It's certainly always nice to send a little welcome gift, maybe has your company logo on it. Just something that says, welcome to the company. We're so excited to have you. Have it mailed to their house or have it there sitting on their desk day one. That's always nice to have. It just makes you feel, very welcome to the organization. Making sure if you are offering benefits, any type of benefits, time off or anything, it's accessible. There's an overview. And just making sure, you're consistently, not just on the day of onboarding, but you're consistently living, the mission of your company, your vision, the values of the companies. Those may change a little bit over time, but just making sure they're highly communicated, they're visible, employees understand what those mean, and then just how that really aligns with your culture and, why that's important to you. And, your business is your baby. So a lot of people really need to understand that, you hiring them is a very important thing to the company. And it's, you don't take that lightly. So there's a lot of resources out there for small companies. I know it doesn't seem that way, but a lot of times, people don't even know what a PEO is, especially I've found in the Carolinas doing this for so many years. A lot of people, I'd say about 70% of the people I talk to have no idea what a PEO is, or even had any idea the value that it can bring to a small business. So just making sure you're aware of those different systems out there. There's tons of payroll companies out there. There are tons of HRIS systems out there, but really the big driving factor is going to be really where a lot more people come to us is healthcare. You can buy payroll anywhere, you can get an HR system anywhere, but really what's going to bring value from our perspective is just going to be that healthcare, because going to a healthcare broker with 2 or 3 or even 10 employees, it's really difficult to get competitive, but then it's also hard to manage those things. If you do terminate someone, who's going to let the broker know and make sure that's taken off the invoice? Who's going to submit the COBRA notices? So those are the things we really don't want to fall on the plate of an entrepreneur. We really want to make sure that we're taking those things out of your hands and onto ours, because we're responsible for the risk associated. There's a lot of engagement tools out there. I mentioned 15Five, but there's a lot of other ones out there. I know WorkDove is one, PeopleLogic. There's a lot around that have grown out of the North Carolina area actually as well. A lot of performance review systems just to keep track of documentation and things like that. Time track, if you have any hourly employees or you have employees that are 40-hour or salaried, but they're making under that $35,000 a year threshold, you're going to need to track time on those employees to ensure you're paying them overtime where applicable. If you are reimbursing for expenses, you're starting to see people use the company credit card more. Get an expense management system. You really need to have that financial oversight over what's going in, what's going out from an expense perspective, because sometimes things get a little bit loose in terms of what people think that they can get expense for or use the company credit card for, or, hey, I had to go to this conference and, you really probably don't need that 5-star hotel. You probably could have done with a 3-star. So just getting, some financial oversight there is really important. And then, like I said, PEOs are a great resource. It doesn't necessarily have to be us. It could be other PEOs, but just understanding what's at your fingertips as a small business to help you get to that next level. And this is just everything that is in terms of PEOs, what they do differing than a regular HR payroll vendor. So in a nutshell, that's what we do for companies. So that's how I've gotten that's how I've gotten to know the HR space quite well. And as I am talking to many small companies, these are some of the biggest things that do come up from a compliance perspective. So I just wanted to share that with the group, and I certainly hope that's helpful. And if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer those. I see someone in the chat. Yes, I can. Andrea asked, will you send out the presentation after? I'm interested in the links. Yes. And are there any other questions or anything that can further clarify? And that's a good point. There's a lot of employment scams out there. It's really unfortunate that people are taking advantage of companies and pretending to hire for a company just to get employees to put their information in or have them pay for something that they shouldn't. It's becoming where you really have to watch our P's and Q's these days. Employees have to kind of be on guard as well.
Marlana, what's the best way for the audience to connect with you going forward?
Sure. I can certainly put my email and phone number in the chat here. But when I send out the PowerPoint, sorry, I can put my information will be in the email as well. So if you do have any questions, or if you know of a small company that could, certainly tap into our services, I'm always happy to speak. But if we're not a good fit, I am more than happy to refer you to other providers that might be a better fit. I just want to make sure everyone gets the resources that they need, especially if people are going after funding, or you're simply looking to start to hire employees. You just want to make sure you have all your stuff in place so you're successful.
That's great. Marlana, thanks again for a wonderful presentation. As a reminder to everyone, Riot hosts Lunch and Learns weekly on Wednesdays at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. You can find a list of our Lunch and Learns on Meetup where you registered for the event. This event was recorded and will be posted to Riot's YouTube channel and the Meetup page where you registered for this event. Thank you all for joining today. I hope everyone has a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.